Discussing life from the liberal side, from the liberal view. Should be an interesting discussion tonight on several topics. Why don't we start with the Postal Service? Seems to be a hot topic.
Mm-hmm.
Who wants to start off? I mean, you've never been shy, one of you?
Well, so we had the sudden replacement 3 months before the election of the postmaster with a Trump loyalist, who then summarily replaced 23 executives of the post office with people who were his handpicked people. And then they started talking about, well, you know, we're going to make these changes that are allegedly to save money, but are going to slow down the Postal Service. And we're going to start warning states that they might not be able to deliver ballots as quickly as the states might have thought. And so, you know, and then we see these reports about postal drop-off boxes being moved and sorting machines being shut down and overtime being curtailed and other rules being put in place that would no longer prioritize the delivery of ballots as effectively first-class mail the way it has been before. So what are we supposed to assume about all that? You know, this is the Trump administration we're talking about. So, you know, what are we supposed to assume? Are we supposed to assume that all these events are innocent? I personally cannot believe that.
There's also key statistics you have to know. They polled both potential Biden or Trump voters as to whether they expect to be using mail-in ballots and whether they're concerned about in-person voting. And roughly 80% of Biden voters said they would prefer to vote by mail, where Trump voters said they would very likely be voting in person. Roughly 80% of them said they would be voting in person. So any rational person seeing that poll and then seeing subsequent actions by the Trump administration would have to assume that they are very well of this and know that Democrats are very concerned about going to the polls directly and that this will help subvert their votes.
Why?
Why?
Why would a Democrat be more worried about going to a polling place than a Republican?
Because of the coronavirus. Because they believe the coronavirus is real and that going to the polls has inherent risk.
Well, I mean, when you say they believe it's real, how can you not believe it's real? There's 175,000 people not having an opinion.
Believe it or not, there's roughly 30% of the populace that believes it's all a hoax, that the numbers are inflated, that they don't want to wear masks, and they're not at all believing the scientific consensus that this is a real situation that needs to be dealt with. And our numbers on the coronavirus reflect that, unfortunately.
But you know, one second, Christine. We ran through the same thing with vaccinations, where a number of people believed it gave you autism because of a crazy science-less study. And, you know, we ran into it in my own little company where somebody said, I don't believe it's real and I'm not going to wear a mask. And we said, that's fine. You're not going to come in the building.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's very simple, whether you believe it or not.
That was the correct response, by the way.
You know, it's like, there's a number of us who do believe it. There's a number of us who believe whether it's real or not, it's up to the management to make sure that the place is safe. So you can decide not to wear a mask. I mean, you know, the guy with the tall hat and the beard took away indentured servitude. So you can decide not to come in, but you got to follow what we believe are the safest rules. Christine, go ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's okay. I was just going to ask, it seems as though, Glenn, you were saying that 30% of the populace doesn't believe that coronavirus is real. That kind of coincides with the number of people who are Trump supporters is around that level. So you've got a mixed message coming from Washington with Trump not wearing a mask, kind of one day questioning the validity of the virus. The next day, saying it's real. No wonder there's a group that's going to say, they don't believe that it's going to be a risk for them. And it seems like anybody who's got half a brain that notices all of a sudden he appoints somebody in the post office that makes radical changes right around the time of the election. Anybody with half a brain is going to see that this is very manipulative move on his part. That and the fact that, he's saying that absentee voting is okay, but mail-in ballots are not. It's the same thing.
Wait a minute, what's the difference?
There is no difference.
I started 2 years ago, maybe 3, when I was driving an hour and a half to get to work. I found out how easy it was to ask Amy to send me my ballot in the mail. Cost me $1 because I got to put 2 stamps on it. And I'm happy to spend $1 because with an hour and a half to 2 hour drive, I was worried I wouldn't get home in time, or I'd have to wait till 8 o'clock and only go in to the office. So I've been doing mail-in ballot. I guess, no, it's not mail-in, it's absentee.
Absentee.
But from what I understand, it's still, I get 1 vote. I still put it in the same envelope. I still mail it to the U.S. Post Office. So I'm kind of slow. I don't understand what the difference is.
You also have to sign it.
Well, yeah.
And faking a signature is one of the hardest things to do. You can't just freehand a signature of somebody else. It's damn near impossible. A lot of people have tried it. It doesn't work. So the idea that people are harvesting votes and signing for people on their behalf and sending in ballots marked whatever way this nefarious group can do them, it just doesn't happen. It can't happen.
Well, except that it did actually happen in what that district in North Carolina where the Republican candidate had this consultant working for him who organized a scheme to do just that. They offered a service to people to deliver their absentee ballots for them, and they voted for people. And
that's true, but the people still had to sign over their ballots. At least that much is safeguarding it.
Yeah, and so I mean,
but the Bush administration spent tens of millions of dollars trying to find organized voter fraud, and they just never found it.
I was going to say, didn't they go through it and prove that there was no massive fraud?
Yeah, they found maybe 8 or 10 cases, and some of them were mistaken voting, like you were an ex-felon and you didn't realize that as an ex-felon you were not allowed to vote, or somebody who was a holder of a green card. So there are instances where people mistakenly vote, and for sure.
But Glenn, is that 0.0001%?
Right, it's out of billions of votes. There are a few of these.
I'm looking at voter fraud, and I'm trying to find something that I could call statistically relevant.
Right.
For sure.
And having 2 people in Milford fill in the ballot wrong doesn't feel like a huge sway.
Now, if we're going to talk about voter fraud, we should really be talking about voter suppression also. So, for example, you have in states, again, controlled by Republicans, you have all kinds of things going on that are designed to either make it a Kafkaesque nightmare to get registered, or arbitrary purges of voter rolls because there are misplaced hyphens or spaces in people's names, that kind of thing, that seemed to happen right before the election. This Brian Kemp in Georgia ran for governor at a time when he himself was Secretary of State. He was in charge of the election that he was a candidate in, and he organized a voter purge that threw several 100,000 people off the rolls.
But now again, Rand, let me just ask a silly question from an old man. It's a 50-50 race, or 50-49.
Yep.
If I throw 100 people or 100,000 off, aren't I most likely going to throw off 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats?
Well, you'd think so, except that usually when you get into the details, when the devil is in the details of how this is done. And so, it's in sneaky stuff like what documentation you have to register to vote. in places like Alabama, or where are polling places plentiful relative to the number of voters or scarce relative to the number of voters. There are all kinds of ways to make it harder for the people you don't want to vote to vote. And every year we see predictable train wrecks in places like Georgia and Florida, where people wait in line for hours. And that's not necessary. We are not a third world country that doesn't have the resources to run a proper election.
Yeah, and again, part of me doesn't understand. Okay, if I mailed my ballot in, even the night before, it's got a postmark, and it takes 4 days instead of 5. Shouldn't I, as a custodian of the people's will, extend the count until I get the ones? Now, if I voted,
yes, you should. But will you be allowed to?
Well, no. If I got my ballot now, like we got the September 1st primary coming. I think I got my 3 ballots came to the House 2 weeks ago or a week ago. Let's say I held them till August 31st or September 2nd. Well, August 31st, I fulfilled the rules. My vote should count, right?
Well, sure. If those are indeed the rules, right?
Aren't they? I thought you had to have your ballot postmarked before the election.
These rules are set by state laws mostly, and so it's it's read the fine print in your state to find out what the rules are.
Well, also we saw in the 2000 election when Florida was attempting to do a massive recount. They had the Brooks Brothers riot outside the polling places and essentially got them to stop counting the votes. Now, Gore made a strategic mistake in that he didn't ask the entire state to be recounted. And if he did, he would have won the election, sadly. That's what the New York Times found when they recounted all the votes. But the Supreme Court interceded and handed George Bush the election. It's an extremely sad commentary on the state of democracy in this country, but that's where we are. And you can almost bet that if it's that close in this election, that there will be challenges to any attempt to recount or properly count the votes. It's just that simple.
Yeah, and I have a fundamental issue with challenges to recount. Except for the economic burden, which again, statistically not relevant to me, it would seem that I would welcome a recount if it's close.
Well, you would, because you're an honest guy.
You don't think our politicians are honest?
Do you think our politicians are honest? I mean, do you think Mr. Trump and his minions are honest?
No.
Well,
of course they're not.
We can argue that all night, but at the end of the day,
I'm up for it.
Yeah, but it's like whatever rules they make, they got to live by.
Not if you're Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump has never in his life believed that there were any rules he had to live by.
Right. And he doesn't care. It's not about having a conscience and living with them, He'll just change the rules to make them fit whatever outcome he wants. I don't trust his administration at all. And I'm sure we're going to have an issue with the election.
Well, Mr. Trump himself does not understand democracy, does not feel that government should serve the people. He thinks government should serve him. And this is the flaw with having a businessman as a leader of a country. A businessman is not used to democracy. It's alien to them. They are used to setting the rules and saying what happens. They'll tell you what to produce and when to produce and how to produce. And if you don't like it, then leave. That's their attitude. And so to have a businessman as a leader of a country is just entirely backwards. We should not be looking for business leaders to run countries. It just doesn't work.
And Glenn, there I cannot agree with you, because when you say we should look for politicians to run countries, They scare me more than the business people.
Well, what is a politician, though, Al? At some point, a lot of people worked in the real world, decided to run for whatever.
Right.
Does that automatically make them a politician?
No, but you could say they're businessmen. They were they ran companies. So to me, you're going to have good politicians and not so good. You're going to have good business people and not so good business people.
I think generally when you look at the people who become CEOs or senior management of major corporations, there's a very high correlation with sociopathy of some kind. Yeah. I mean, so I don't necessarily trust people like that to run a country, to be in control of democracy. And it's certainly alien to their day-to-day lives for however long they've been in senior management or the CEO of a major corporation. It's just not their thing.
I am going to have to interrupt and take a short break to take care of my 1-year-old grandson who just woke up. So I'll be right back. Keep talking.
I'm surprised that you drew the short end of the stick. Carolyn got the grandson.
We had him for a week.
Well, now let's talk about the campaign or the lack thereof.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this has got me totally confused. I don't see much campaigning.
Well, a lot of it, it's a brave new world right now. A lot of it is happening through phone calls and social media and texting and things like that. In normal circumstances, we'd be knocking on tons of doors weekend after weekend. It can't happen now. So
you got to think outside the box now and do different kinds of approaches.
Campaigning is entirely different right now.
Mm.
But, I hear that, let me be candid, I'm confused why Joe Biden doesn't want to debate. I understand he's leading the polls, so statistically he probably has more to lose, but I'd love to see the two of them square off. Am I missing something?
I think they've already agreed to 3, haven't they?
I thought so too. In fact, Trump was trying to push to do a debate earlier, but they're waiting now until, I don't know when the first debate is, but there are debates scheduled as far as
there's 3. The thing that kind of made me curious is that some of the debates happen after people have voted.
Well, you don't know when people are going to vote, because right after the primary, then there's...
Oh, thank God he got the maternal genes for looks.
Yep. We'll see how this works out. This is Logan Barthel.
Hi,
hello, Logan.
My son's son. Yeah.
Does Logan have an opinion on what's going on?
He thinks that living around here is mostly pretty good, except when things don't go so well, and then sometimes he thinks I'm an axe murderer.
So now, if we get to see the debates, and I believe we will, what would you like to see discussed?
You know what? I wouldn't mind seeing anything discussed, because it'll be interesting to see how a one-on-one debate with Donald Trump will look. The man has not been able to complete a sentence. I don't think he has a clue as to any kind of policy issues or his position. And it'll be interesting to see if he kind of gets his back up against the wall by Biden, how he handles that, because he's got a quick temper. He's not going to be able just to leave the debate abruptly because he doesn't like the questions, or maybe he can. I don't know.
I actually think it almost doesn't matter which issue issues they take on, because the real issue is Trump and his character and his complete inability to function as the custodian of a public trust, and
it's
that's the real issue.
He's completely failed to manage the coronavirus at all. There's been no national response. In fact, when it was primarily in blue states, he decided to use it as a political cudgel against the left and against Democrats. He decided there would be no national response. All the governors are on their own. And even when we were trying to secure our own PPE for our first line workers, they were actually confiscating them to the point where Robert Kraft had to use his own private jet to procure some, I believe it was in South Korea, and fly it back. And so now that there's a massive bonfire in Florida and Texas, two places that they were praising profusely in Fox in mid-May, saying that they had the problem solved and that the Northeast should really take a good look at what they're doing. Now they're complete disasters, and they've got no answer and no way to stem the tide. There's no a testing program. There's no way to get PPE to these places because it's spreading so fast. And we do lead in tests, as Trump likes to say. We do test a lot of people, but it's only because the virus is so out of control.
Well, what would you do different? I mean, Glenn, I hear you can't get PPE. Now, I ordered a box of N95 masks and got them in yesterday. Mm-hmm. I just ordered KN95 masks for my grandson.
Mm-hmm. Well, at this point, you can because China is reopened. At the time when the Trump administration was confiscating the PPE, China had closed down already and nothing was going in or out of China. Now is a different story. But we don't have any national response right now. What we really need to do is test and quarantine people until we've entirely eliminated the virus, and other countries have done that. If you look at a place like South Korea, they had their first case on the same day. It was January 20th. And let me make sure I have the stats right here. They're a country of 50, let's see, where are they here?
56 million or something?
They're a sixth in our population.
Yeah, about a sixth. Between a sixth and a seventh.
And if I remember correctly, they're around 300 deaths. Let me just double check that.
Yeah, so you multiply that by a factor of 6 or 7, you get a number in the 3,000 range.
Right, so 306 deaths. Actually, not even. It would be 6 times. So it would be about 1,800.
And we're 175,000.
175,000, yep. And it's very interesting that the three far-right countries lead the world in this, the US, Brazil, and India. All of them have basically authoritarian far-right leaders, and all have done a terrible job in managing the coronavirus.
You think the US is far-right?
Yeah, well, I think
government certainly is. The federal government. Yeah.
It was 50% voted against the government.
But in terms of leadership right now,
leadership.
Those decisions.
And the Republican Party in particular. And I'll.
But what would you do different now? I mean, I'm stuck. I would not want to be in that hot seat to make the decision as to whether or not I close the country down.
We have to do another lockdown, another 10-week or so lockdown, and then the only way we come back out again is if we test everybody. I mean, it really has to be that simple. You know, we have to make sure that the pockets of viruses are isolated and contained, and we just haven't done that.
So beyond that,
let's say I have to eat in the interim.
Well, true, and you know, we need to provide food, and other countries do that very effectively. Their social safety net allows for people to stay home and the government to provide them food directly. We don't do that here. We force our workers back to work on the front lines and spread coronavirus in our meatpacking plants, and so it's no wonder that our numbers are where they are. And you know, while the average worker is being forced back to work right now without any plan to contain anything, the wealth class is shuttling off to their own private islands or behind their manses, and they don't care. Bottom line, you know, they are having parties, but when they have their parties, they have tests that you can get results back in 15 minutes. And they know whether somebody's infected, and if you're infected, well, you get turned away at the door.
Have you tried that 15-minute test?
No, I haven't.
3.5 hours later, I was still waiting for that 15-minute result.
Well, 3.5 hours is still better than 5 days or 9 days or.
Well, that's the rapid.
A lot of the testing that we're doing is frankly useless because the results are not coming back fast enough to do anything useful with them.
We had all of our employees go and take the rapid test and the PCR-based test simultaneously, because the PCR-based test has proven to give better results, but it takes 2 to 3 days to get your results from that.
Right.
And the rapid test at least made me feel better that everybody in my office came back negative.
Yeah.
We still had to wait, and now we're taking the next step, which is 1 week later, we're having everybody retested on the PCR test. Because there is the question that if I go, say I'm infected today, the viral load may be low enough that it doesn't get picked up, but 7 days from when I get infected, it's going to be there if it's there.
Right.
So, from that end, I didn't need the government to tell me what to do. My company didn't need the government. We paid for testing 3 tests of every employee. That made us feel more comfortable. There's no guarantee. Somebody could go out and be silly in between and bring it back. But
the problem with that, though, is that if everybody is setting their own rules, then you're only as safe as the least responsible person, and they can spread the virus very, very quickly just by being irresponsible.
And that's the real problem here. The deeper problem here is that the Trump administration has not even tried to summon the community solidarity that we need to take and to implement any of the strategies that would control this thing. You've got to get everybody doing the same thing. You've got to perhaps have a national shutdown of everything you can shut down for a period of, say, 3 weeks or something, in order to get the rate of new infections down to the point where you can actually have a comprehensive testing and tracing program, with the resources you have. It's there's a lack of thinking what you would have to do to control this.
I gotta jump off.
We'll wait for you.
I'll try to jump back on in a bit. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Great seeing you, Christine.
Right.
But now, what do you do, Rand? Do you offer to pay these people?
Possibly, yes. It's now or later, because the longer you go without controlling this thing, the longer the economic depression goes on. And, it's going to end up costing you more in the long run in both lives and money to kind of keep, farting around with this.
So the UK, I want to say it was back in January as well, their health minister came out and said something to the effect that we're just going to rely on herd immunity. We're not going to deal with any of this. We'll just let everybody get infected, and whatever happens, happens. And obviously, the outrage from the community and the press was overwhelming, and they said, "Okay, well, maybe we'll actually do something about it." But I think there is that idea in the right wing, that we're just going to let it go, and at some point we'll reach herd immunity, and then we won't have to deal with this anymore. And I think that's what's behind when Trump says, one day it's just going to go away. I think that's really what he's relying on. But the fact is that viruses like the coronavirus, it's very hard to develop any kind of long-term immunity from it. Just like we don't get an immunity from the common cold.
Glenn, we've been fighting an AIDS virus for how many decades?
For sure.
We've been fighting the flu. I mean, you think of influenza. Every year we pick 3 strains and hope we got the most prevalent. But that's right. I don't see the flu going away in the near term.
But the thing about the flu is it's a little bit different. The other illness that would be similar was SARS. And we tried to create a vaccine for SARS, and we failed. We couldn't figure one out. And the reality is that with the way the coronavirus infects the body, it's a pretty good chance we're never going to have a vaccine for it. or at least not for a very long time. So to rely on something like herd immunity it's going to be a death sentence for an awful lot of people in this country if that's the.
So we have to rely on having more effective treatments,
right?
So that we can keep people alive when they get this.
I'm hoping that I am absolutely wrong when I say that I've never heard of a long-term vaccine being developed, a long-term safe vaccine being developed in 6 months.
Trump is actually already seeding that idea that he thinks he might have one in October. Vaccines normally take somewhere between 18 months and 2 years.
2 years.
To really test properly. And so God only knows what he's going to release. I think it's something he wants as an October surprise for the public to believe that he actually has dealt with this coronavirus and that now we have a vaccine and everybody's going to be safe and happy and can go back to what they were doing before. But the reality is it's just not true.
Well, I'm not going to be one lining up for the Russian vaccine that came out in months.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, I won't be either, for sure not.
Yeah, and I won't be lining up for the Trump vaccine for the same reason.
Right.
Well, again, after living in the biotech world long enough, and somebody telling me we're going to have a safe vaccine, I can have a vaccine, safe, effective vaccine.
Yeah, known to be safe and effective. Yeah, right. Yeah, you're in the biz, so you actually know how long these things take.
Yeah.
Just the full clinical trials.
Yeah.
Take more than a few months. Just lining up 30,000 people.
Yeah.
Think of the logistics and
there are things about that can't really be speeded up a lot.
Putting 9 women together, trying to have a baby in a month, unless you're starting with one that's 8 months pregnant, the math just doesn't work.
It doesn't. Not without technological breakthroughs that we don't want to see.
Mathematics you can't beat.
Right.
Now,
but even then, I hear that the antibodies just they don't stick around that long. Like maybe a couple to 3 months. You might have to have a booster like every 3 months just to be reasonably safe, but that seems untenable.
Well, it also depends. I've seen some of the data that came out, and they were looking at the IgM antibodies, which are the initial shock troop. They're only supposed to be there for a short period of time while the body builds up the long-term IgGs. So again, you got to be careful. And I will admit, I am not unbiased in my support of a fellow Holy Cross Crusader, Tony.
Yes.
I like him. I like his science. So I tend to lean more towards his interpretation of science than the politicians who were political science majors and maybe took 2 months of biology.
And who now claim that they know more about science than the scientists do.
Yeah.
Right.
But now, okay, talk to me about, we picked an interesting vice presidential candidate. I'm expecting you to be very supportive. Is that correct?
Well, basically, I mean, I've got an Elizabeth Warren shirt on here. I'm a huge fan of hers, and I was pushing for her to be vice president. And having seen this choice, I can understand why Biden made this choice, and I think that in a sense he really had to do this because the Democratic Party in general has been taking its black constituents for granted for way too long, and so I'm inclined to think that this is probably what needed to happen right now in this time of racial ferment, so I obviously wish them well. I will, once they're elected, I will be pushing them to be more aggressive in their policy proposals and plans than what they showed during the primary campaign. And I think that Biden has shown some indications that he understands that he has to go, that this is not a normal time and he's going to have to do bigger things than what he originally had in mind. So
Well,
we'll see how that works out.
Wasn't that what your friend Bernard was calling him out on?
Well, yeah, exactly. And
hey, don't forget us. If you get nominated and elected, don't forget who helped you get there.
Yeah, and so there's a whole lot of constituencies that can all say that to some extent. So we've just seen the black part of the Democratic Party say that, and we're going to see that other parts of the Democratic Party are going to be making that kind of case for the policies they want to see. But right now, it's basically all about getting them elected, because 4 more years of Trump, this country will be a failed state.
See, in there, Rand, I'll never agree to that.
Yeah, well, you aren't going to convince me, because
we've gone through president after president that everybody said the world would end, and somehow the U.S. stays the course. Could it be better, or dependent on your opinion? But to say that the country will fail,
we've not had a kind of a diagnosable psychopath in the White House before, and I think that he's already shown that a lot of the guardrails that we thought would protect us have already failed. And if he has 4 years to complete the full corruption of the government without any effective restraints, I think that we'll start to resemble some of those countries that he had uncomplimentary things to say about a couple of years ago.
I wonder, if they had impeached him and Pence took over, we'd be a lot more conservative than we are, because I don't think Pence would open his mouth the way Trump does.
Pence is an ideologue for sure.
He's an ideological robot.
He's a Christian supremacist, which is equally scary. So I wouldn't feel good about putting him in charge. I think a lot of Republicans would feel better about him being in charge, but I know I certainly would not.
Yeah.
No, I got to admit, the far right scares me as much as the far left. To me, both of them that vote dogma are scary. When I think about who I'd rather have in there, I mean, the debate, I'm not sure I don't want to watch the debate for the comic relief, because I don't know who's going to make a bigger faux pas, Biden or Trump, because they've both not controlled their dialogue very well, at least my opinion.
I think Biden is prone to gaffes for sure. Says a lot of things that could be said better by others, but
and Trump doesn't.
Well, no, I'm not saying that Trump is comparatively better. Not at all. In fact, Trump says completely offensive things, and he says it with a straight face, or he'll just blatantly lie about things. And I think he gets pretty old, and I think people get worn down by it. The fact that he constantly lies about everything. And the sad thing is that because he says it, a lot of people still believe him, even though things are demonstrably false. And that's what's really dangerous about Trump in particular. He acts more like a cult leader than he does a political leader. And guys like that are much more dangerous.
But now let's shift over. Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
Your opinion?
We've had a 400-year problem with systemic racism in this country, and every now and then it comes to a boil. So we're going to continue to have eruptions like this until we address it.
Yeah, and thank God for cell phones with cameras, because a lot of these events that we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years, it would purely be the narrative would be whatever the police union said. And they've been prone to lie over and over again about the course of events. You see it with virtually every case. The police union come out and say, oh, the guy charged us. He had no choice. But you see with videos like the fellow in South Carolina whose name escapes me, he was running away from the police officer, and the police officer shot him in the back and dropped a stun gun next to him, and then filed a police report saying that he reached for the stun gun and had no choice. And this is, the guy was convicted, and that's great. But, unfortunately, this is something that happens way too often. There's a lot of questionable cases like this. And so I think ultimately something has to be done. There have been a lot of changes that have made policing easier and to give police less accountability. Unfortunately, over the last 30 or 40 years, we have a qualified immunity that has been applied to the police force, which basically gives them blanket immunity for anything that they do as a police officer. And what ends up happening is, instead of them paying the price for their illegality or failures as a police officer to conduct themselves properly, it's the municipality that pays. And that isn't fair either. We hire
Glenn, that, the 1% that are bad cops, or whatever, less than 1%, whatever it is, the very few, I 100% support dealing with them. The Black Lives, what I believe, and I'm naive, I'll admit it, but what I believe the core of the Black Lives Matter movement is fundamentally sound. What I can't support is, I'll give you an example. We had 2 Black Lives Matter parades in Milford, or whatever you want to call them, movement.
Right.
Demonstrations through the town, demonstrations. Thank you. They marched through the town. They made their point in an orderly, peaceful way, and I thought that was great. Mm-hmm. Just like every citizen of Milford, you know what I mean? You have the right to say yay or nay to anything. Mm-hmm. I didn't see them breaking in to stores or looting, and that's where I draw the line, because I can't support the dilution of the message, because all you see on the media is the stores burning, or people throwing rocks.
Right.
One thing you have to
leads.
Yeah, but you have to understand also that there are always agent provocateurs that are in these movements, that they're there to cause trouble, and whether they're there as agents of the police, or they're there as agents of the far right who are there to make the movement look bad. We've had all of the above, unfortunately, during all of these events. There was a famous incident, I want to say it was in Minneapolis, a guy,
the window guy, or the umbrella guy.
He was obviously white. He had a gas mask on, and he walked up to the AutoZone store, where the burning started, and was smashing the windows out. And when the protesters confronted him to ask him who he was and what he was doing, he wouldn't answer, and then he turned around and left. But he had an umbrella on his, so he couldn't be videoed from above, because they have drones over these things.
And one of the things we have to be sensitive to is, especially in our little center of the universe here, Milford, we don't see what some of these inner city people are going through. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of our inherited family is a man a student who went to school with my daughter, who's become part of my family. And one day his car broke down, so he was going to go rent one. I laughed. I said, well, Emily's car's in the garage. Take that. Mm-hmm. And he laughed, and he said, okay, but make sure you have bail money for me.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you mean bail money? He goes, DWB. And I honestly looked at him. I had no idea that meant driving while black. And he said, I'm going to be in a Lexus with a license plate called Emily, right? With a little cheerleader thing on it. He goes, I'm going to draw a lot of attention. And I just sat there and said, why? Unless you're speeding. And he goes, it's the way of the world. So I guess if I had to live with that pressure, I don't know how I'd react.
So, in Mendon, I don't know what's going on in Milford, but in Mendon, there are a whole lot of signs people put up that say, that have a stylized picture of a policeman, and they say, defend the police, with defund the police, with a U crossed off and an E put in to make it defend the police. And I think it's worth asking, because I'm not in favor of defunding the police. However, I think we have to understand that there are people for whom their experience of policing is such that they perceive the police to be more of a threat to them than a help. And, you know, that is a fact that a lot of us white folks have no way of having an experience of, because we live in a segregated society. We live in we have settlement and housing patterns that are segregated, and that are the result of decades of deliberate government policies that caused this segregation to happen, starting with really the beginning of suburbia. And so, you know, because of that, we now are segregated in our perceptions, as well as segregated in where we live. And
Rand, you're bringing up a point. When I see defend the police, what comes to mind is defend the good cops, the legit cops.
And what I'm saying is that all those people who are putting up those signs, I'll bet it hasn't occurred to 90% of them to wonder what would induce someone to want to defund the police.
And I think we ought to be clear about what defund the police means. You know, I think there are a small segment of people that want to basically eliminate the police force, but that's not really what this is about. What this is really about is a number of things, but one is that we've called the police to do a whole lot of things that they're really not qualified or shouldn't be doing. If somebody's having a psychotic episode, somebody calls 911, the police show up, and they're suddenly the first line responders to try to deal with someone who's having a psychotic issue, and we should have social workers to deal with that. And so there's
a uniformed guy with a gun is not the right
point-blank question. What social worker in their right mind is going to go in to an apartment where somebody's having a psychotic episode or has a live weapon? Isn't that asking too much of a $30,000, $40,000 payment for a social worker?
Well, you know, they deal with a lot of people who are on the edge already. They do that in their day-to-day lives, and they know how to talk to people and de-escalate situations in their way. The police have their own de-escalation protocols, but that doesn't really work on somebody who is having an episode. And so cops are very quick. You know, if somebody's holding a knife, they're not necessarily in that situation going to attack the cops, but you know, to use force immediately on them because they are holding the weapon and may not be rational enough to know to drop the weapon is inappropriate as well. So you really need somebody who knows how to deal with those situations directly. The other thing I would think of is, you know, the fact that we have cops who are administering, you know, what is it? The drug to get people over.
Narcan.
Narcan, yeah, thank you. Yeah. You know, again, that's probably an inappropriate use of their time and their resources. But then the other part of defund the police is just not having all these militarized police forces with tanks and high caliber weapons and body armor that you know is really used for warfare. I mean, we just the average cop does not need that, and certainly we don't need that in Milford. I know we have a new SWAT team in town, but even that is probably excess, in my opinion.
Yeah, but see, when the SWAT concept came up, I can tell you there were a number of us on the finance committee that voted for it because of one statistic. It takes, on average, 42 minutes, which is pretty good, to get a SWAT team to a school. All the events that have happened are over in 18. Now, I got to admit, and it's a character flaw, but if the kids in my town are in danger from somebody with a gun, I got to admit, I really don't care about their rights anymore. I care about those kids. And having a SWAT team is the only alternative that anybody presented to me.
So I was lucky enough to run into a security expert, I want to say 4 years ago, going door to door for a political campaign. And the fellow told me that we have SWAT teams in the area and that they would likely be here within 5 to 10 minutes. And so there just was no need for this town-specific SWAT team.
If that was the case, it was not presented. What was presented at the Finance Committee was an average of 42 minutes, and that most of the events are over in 18. That's what swayed my vote. I looked at Chris Moran and I said, if we don't vote for this and something happens, how will we ever look at some mother or father with a straight face?
Well, what you just said actually is the dilemma that every public official goes through, right? You can always justify more security as long as an event doesn't happen. Because if you don't approve the security and an event does happen, you're the one who's going to be blamed for that problem. And that's how we've ended up with enormous police budgets. And so the defund the police statement or idea is really just about putting that back in line with the actual needs of the people.
That I'll agree with. But when I see them cutting budgets just randomly, we're going to cut.
I don't agree with that. I didn't agree with the thing that happened at the town meeting either. That you can't take a cleaver and just randomly chop things. It doesn't make any sense. Well, if you want to make a case, fine, make your case and say what things specifically should be cut. But
what I know will happen is the first place most police chiefs will cleaver out of their budget is training.
Yep.
And to me, that's the worst thing to take out.
I would say that, that should be increased, not decreased, based on our desire to not have any more of these awful incidents where police do the wrong thing.
Be increased.
So can we go back to the protests one more time?
Yes.
So up in Portland, there's been a lot of protesting going on. There are a bunch of groups up there who have been protesting in town. One is a group called the Proud Boys. And they are an overtly fascist group. They glorify violence, and they are a far-right group. They are not from that town. They're from surrounding areas, and they come into the town and they terrorize the black and brown people who are there, and the community has risen up to oppose them over and over again, and a lot of them call themselves Antifa. Now, if you look at what's been going on in the city, there are some incidents where the police and these fascists were working together and even exchanging texts to coordinate what was going to happen at these protests. So that is entirely unacceptable. And let's also be clear that the group Antifa is not a nationwide group. It doesn't have a head. It is not an organized group. It is merely a group that is against fascism. And they pop up in towns when fascism presents itself, and when groups like the Proud Boys march through town.
The Antifa group, don't they believe in fascism?
Well, no.
It literally means anti-fascist.
Right. But they run around and pull cameras and don't let people talk. Isn't that fascism?
No. What they're against is oppression, and specifically the kind of oppression that the Proud Boys and the violence that the Proud Boys want to bring.
I agree that anybody who's trying to suppress my right to free speech, anybody who's against that pesky First Amendment doesn't get any support from me. But if you try and stop me from talking peacefully, then I can't support any group.
What do you feel about the police shooting the media with rubber bullets when they're trying to report on protests?
Again, that's the kind of thing I'd like to have studied and understand, because if they're there peacefully reporting, that's part of the First Amendment.
For sure.
They get to talk. They get to give their view. I read the New York Times. I know that is not the most unbiased paper out there, okay? But they have very good journalism. I will support even the skinheads if they want to live in Idaho and Montana and places where they have no contact with anybody, that's their right. The minute they start trying to impose their rights on people, then I draw the line and say, no way.
Which is exactly what a lot of people have done in Portland with these guys.
Right.
However, I think it should be said that Antifa, quote unquote, is I think more of an idea than it is a group. It has roots in thinking about how the fascist movements were able to take over the streets in 1930s Germany and Italy, and how the thought being that no, we cannot allow brown shirts and thugs like that to run wild, and if that happens, we actually have to oppose them with force in the streets.
Well,
as was done in Britain.
8 years, and heads come
right. And so all I'm saying is that's kind of the root of the idea.
Nobody will feed the stray cats because they come, they put fecal matter in my mailbox, whatever they call their newspaper, and if nobody pays attention, they go away to somewhere else.
Right.
I can't say they can't come. This is America. They have the right to their opinion. I may think it's stupid,
but we also don't have to cede the floor to them either, and we don't have to pretend that they have a decent or valued or even a good opinion that should be even considered. They should be shouted out of any public space that they're in. As simple as that, because there is no place for society in those people.
If you start censoring, I mean, I don't like them. I don't like anything about.
I'm not saying censor them. I'm saying make it very uncomfortable to be a fascist or a Nazi or someone in the KKK, such that being in public and publicly stating those views leads to consequences, social, economic, or otherwise, that would make you not want to do that.
I think the way we handled it in Boston a week after Charlottesville was actually a pretty good example of how to handle it. We had a far right group that wanted to have a rally on Boston Common. So we had the rally on Boston Common. The Boston police cordoned off the area so that kept them far enough apart so they couldn't throw things at each other. And a few dozen of them showed up, and 20,000 of us showed up, and we all made our point, and those of us made the point that not only do we believe in democracy and freedom and human rights, but there are 1,000 of us for every one of you.
And that, to me, is the way it should be.
Yeah.
I mean, they had their right, 10 of them, 12 of them. Do your little voodoo dance, do whatever you're going to do. But don't try and stop my right to say, I don't like you.
Right.
Right. And I'll go, I want to take a slight tack.
We only have 30 seconds, so go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to make it fast. Bill Barr is trying to outlaw being part of Antifa. While Antifa has no body count, they are not terrorists. They have not killed anybody in the 40 years or so that they've been around here in the U.S. Meanwhile, the far right groups, like the Boogaloo Boys, who are starting riots, like the Proud Boys, they have a rather extensive body count, and it's high time somebody takes that seriously.
Yeah, and I have a hard time with this title, Proud Boys. First of all, I've never understood, if I love Milford, which I do, why I would destroy parts of it. It just feels wrong. But I also don't want somebody coming into my town messing up my neighborhood.
Right.
That whole thing. But unfortunately, it's time. Thanks so much. As always, to our 6 loyal viewers, may God bless. May tomorrow be a better night than tonight. And the next time we get together, we should be able to talk about how close to an election we are. Good night, all. Thanks for joining.
Good night, everybody.
Not too long since I've been home.